Hey, welcome to the Working Wellbeing podcast. Thank you so much for listening to our listeners, but also thank you so much for our guest today. Andrew Davidson's joining us on the line. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Matt. How you doing?
I am pretty good, yeah. So we've been meaning to catch up for a couple of weeks, right? Because you were speaking at the Health and Wellbeing at Work conference that we attended. Was that 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? The time
2
flies.
weeks ago, I think, wasn't it? Yeah, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So you were one of the speakers and contributors at that event, right?
That's right. Yeah, I had 4 slots, all on employment law.
Yeah, we were just saying this. They got their pound of flesh for 4 slots over the 2 days. I love it.
Yeah, it's a lot over 2 days, but yeah, they're good sessions, I think.
Yeah, nice one. And we were obviously we were the official podcast of the event. When the opportunity came up to again touch base with one of the headline speakers. I've just made you a headline speaker. I grabbed it with both hands. For the purpose of our audience, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, yeah. I'm Andrew Davidson. I'm the National Head of Employment at a law firm called Hempsons. We act mostly for employers. I'm an employment lawyer, and in the public sector and the private sector, so across the piece.
Nice one. So I always ask people about their career journeys. How have you got to where you got to today? What's the journey been?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a lot of lawyers go through law at university and then go and do law school and, are on a track. And I didn't do that. Did philosophy and politics and then left university, didn't quite know what to do, thought law sounded a good idea. Gradually went to law school, did that. And then I qualified into a commercial firm. And so completely sort of unrelated to the work I'm doing now. Was there for a couple of years and then I've been a lawyer ever since. From about 2003-04, I've focused more on client base like NHS clients, public sector clients, but with some private work thrown in.
And what drew you towards that type of work? Was it a particular interest in it?
It was accident to begin with. It just happened to be the firm. I got a good offer from a firm that I joined, and they did dominantly NHS work and local authority work. Having done some of that work, I realised how interesting it was, the sort of challenges it throws up. And once you get into a sector that you find really interesting, then it kind of naturally progresses from there, and it's been a good challenge ever since.
Yeah, I got you. And so walk me through kind of day to day. What sort of things are you getting involved with you said you work primarily on the kind of on behalf of the employers themselves, right?
Yes, that's right. So we're very employer focused. So on a day-to-day basis, my team will deal with employment tribunals. We get lots of tribunals coming through. We defend the employer in those cases against unfair dismissal, discrimination, whistleblowing type of complaints. We also advise a lot on disciplinary processes, policies and procedures, that kind of thing. And the odd query that comes in, and sometimes they are very odd. A query is about, what do I do in this situation as an employer? We've got an employee who's done this or an employee that wants something. How do we manage that and stay within the law?
Yeah. You know what I'm going to ask you now? What
Go
are
on.
the odd things? What's the oddest thing you've seen?
What's the oddest thing? We've had some very odd things over the years. I mean, you get employees who do very odd things in the workplace, and it always surprises me because you think, well, why would you do these things at work? We get a lot of queries around, as you would expect, discriminatory behaviour, that kind of thing. I'm just trying to think of I've got plenty of odd cases that I can't talk about because they're confidential, unfortunately. But I'm just trying to think. I did once have a case involving, this is the first thing that comes to mind. I had a case involving a very large, as in very physically imposing man, who was an employee who wanted the tribunal to believe that one of his female colleagues, who was probably about 4'2" and very slight, had bundled him into a van and kidnapped him for a few hours. And it was inherently very unbelievable because you see the two of them. It was completely made up, had no basis in fact whatsoever. And I think the tribunal judge was struggling to contain her laughter at the idea that this, enormous man would have been physically bundled by a tiny lady. So that was funny. But yeah, we get lots of odd queries,
Yeah, I bet. That is an odd one. Yeah. So the talk that you were doing or taking part in at the conference a couple of weeks ago, you just ran me through some of those before. So one of the ones that you were looking at was the law around mental health. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So what was the focus of that discussion?
The focus very much on what employers need to do. And from a health and safety perspective, making sure that the workplace is safe for people in both a physical sense, but also in a mental sense, making sure that, there aren't too many stressors in a workplace, making sure you remove those kind of things, making reasonable adjustments for people that have mental health conditions or impairments. And that's one of the queries that we often get, what's reasonable in these circumstances to make allowance for somebody who's suffering from a mental health condition.
That's interesting. So have you seen any rise in terms of organisations being taken to some of these tribunals around mental health related issues?
Definitely. The number of cases around mental health conditions has increased. The tribunals don't keep statistics on the types of claims that are being brought when it comes to disability. So we don't know for sure, but I think every employment lawyer will tell you the same thing, which is we're seeing an increase in these sorts of claims, whether it's ADHD, autism, sometimes stress, any of those sorts of things can materialize in a tribunal claim.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that I'm really interested in, I'm a bit of a geek around, to be perfectly honest, is this whole piece around the intersection between well-being and health and safety, and the measurement and management of psychosocial risk and whatnot.
Yes.
And the idea that, as you know, that organisations are legally bound to not cause harm, certainly physically, but also psychologically. Right. And that, it's interesting. Not many people know that is in the original law, that around the psychological harm that can come from work as well. You will know there was an ISO standard, right? And that was launched a few years ago, ISO 45003, for those who are interested in looking it up. That was almost, well, you could probably tell me a little bit more from the legal side of things. My understanding is it's a standard that sits alongside the law, right? Around the management of health and safety in the workplace. But that at the time was seen as almost like a new thing. And I was thinking, well, no, because organizations have always had this health and safety standard in place, in the sense that they can't knowingly cause harm to people. But yeah, putting the word mental health in front of it, or psychological health, changed it a little bit.
I think so. And one of the things that came up in the discussion we had at the conference was somebody made a good point, which I agree with, which is if you go back to the 70s and the health and safety legislation then and the key provisions, the focus inevitably was on the physical at that point, far more than the mental. It's still there. It's still an obligation to ensure, you take steps for employees' mental health. But over the years, that emphasis has shifted a bit. And so, you've only got to look at the guidance from HSE on stressors and the types of things that cause difficulties, and you can see the direction of travel. So I think, some of the original legislation is very broad, and it enables you to say that it's also included, as you rightly say, psychological issues as well. But over the years, the guidance has become a lot clearer.
Absolutely. And what always interests me around that is how I see a parity between those things, especially as I work in this sort of area. I see a parity between the physical and psychological well-being, mental health. But the difficulty is that individual judgment comes into it, right? So if an organization's got, this is very crude, but an exposed piece of wiring, live wiring, and it's electrocuting people, that is quite obviously a breach of health and safety law, and if somebody does get hurt by that, they are liable, I would assume, having not sorted out the problem in the first place. When it comes to psychological well-being and stresses and demands and these sorts of things, that's for me a little bit more blurred, right? Because an exposed piece of wiring will hurt 100 people out of 100 who touch it, whereas a 16-hour day might hurt 50, but 50 would be fine. Do you see what I mean?
I agree with you, and I think there's an issue for managers very often as well, because, as you say, some of the physical stuff is so obvious and it's clearly a risk. That silent risk, the risk that gets hidden very often when your employees and your team are very stressed and they're subject to all those kind of stresses, is exactly that. It's hidden very often, and unfortunately, it takes somebody to either be caused harm or to create a grievance or to do something to bring it to the attention before anybody takes it seriously, because it very often goes under the radar, doesn't it? So it is harder. And we see that in tribunals. We see, employees understandably sometimes unwilling or unhappy to bring their conditions to the attention of managers. But then it can often result in a problem later on when they're subject to stress or whatever it happens to be, and the employer doesn't really know what's going on, but it can result in a claim. So it is difficult. I think it is very difficult from the physical, very, very different from the physical.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a shame in a way. I would love for it to be simple.
It'd be great if it was, but it wouldn't create work for lawyers. So, there's a downside for me. But I do think, I think it comes down to training managers partly. It comes down to having an opportunity for employees to bring those concerns out in a way that doesn't create more stress and difficulties for them. There's no easy answers, I don't think. But if you have a culture of well-being and a culture of encouraging people to come out and say if they are subject to difficulties, I think that's going to help.
And I know you kind of come at it from the employer's angle, but where does this is literally me plucking this phrase out of thin air because I'm not a lawyer. Where does the burden of proof lie? You know, is it up to the employee to prove that they've been harmed? You know, if it's a physical thing, you could physically, for want of a better word, show that harm has been done, right? But when it comes to psychological and mental health related things, is it more difficult for them to prove, and where does that burden of proof lie?
It is difficult. It depends on the sort of claim that's being brought from an employment perspective. So if you're bringing a claim, let's say you bring in a claim for constructive dismissal, where you've resigned because you've said your employer's subjected you to a great deal of psychological stress and unreasonable behaviour. In that situation, the burden of proof is on you as an employee because you're the one who's resigned and you've said you're going to bring this claim. The evidence is the crucial thing, and both parties are going to have to rely upon medical evidence. And it can be difficult because like everybody, employees have got other stresses in their lives. We all have personal stresses that come about from other reasons. And you've got to take medical evidence and get the best judgment you can on what the primary cause of that is. And in many cases, of course, it's always going to be a mix. You know, it's very unlikely that an employee's got a completely stress-free personal life. They'll have stresses at home, but the tribunals and the courts are going to have to find their way through based on the medical evidence they
Like you say, it's always going to be a mix, though, isn't it? Yeah, because
always.
I've
Always.
heard this before. You know, it's well, this person was going through a divorce, so that's the main cause of the stress that they were experiencing. And it's like, well, yes, but why were they getting divorced in the first place? Oh, because they were working 16-hour days nonstop.
That's right. There's an indirect link, and I mean sometimes it's more straightforward because you can have somebody that's not had any mental health concerns or conditions. They've never been to the GP. They've got a completely clean bill of health, and then they start going to a GP about stress or whatever, and it's clear from the beginning that it's work-related stress. But those cases aren't very they're not common. I mean, most of the time people have a different number of stresses, don't they, in their lives.
Yeah, I've got you. That's fascinating. So where do you feel the responsibility lies or should lie for you between employee and employer?
Well, if you go back to the original health and safety legislation, all the guidance, of course, it's a joint effort. It's not just on the employer to make sure the employee is safe. There's a positive obligation on the employee to ensure that they bring to their employer's attention any concern. So it has to be a joint venture. And if you think about disability, I mentioned mental health conditions. Your employer can only do so much without knowing A, what your condition is, and B, what effect it has on your ability to do your job. And if you don't share that information, I mean, there comes a point where the employer has that knowledge anyway. So you can't, as an employer, you can't put your hands over your ears and your eyes and ignore things. And so sometimes we've had cases where employees are clearly not well and they dispute it and they say, no, I'm fine. But it's obvious there's something going on. But generally speaking, you have to work with your employer. So you have to be able to give them the relevant information. You have to give them access to your occupational health reports, all this stuff working together. So the obligation must be on both sides. It can't just be the employer and it can't be down to the employee alone. It must be a joint venture.
Yeah. I mean, look, from the other angle, when I'm going into organisations, I always talk about the similar thing. We want to take a systemic approach from a positive angle as well. We're not just talking about the prevention of harm, but you know, if you want to create a positive environment, the individual has some level of responsibility to help create that. The employer has a level of responsibility as well.
And I think the other thing, Matt, is that you know, you can see it purely in terms. Sometimes employers see it purely in terms of, oh, you know, these measures are going to cost us more, or they're going to cause us difficulties. One of the things that I think we have seen increasingly is that when it comes to recruitment and when it comes to retention, increasingly employees are saying, what is the culture? What are you doing for my mental health? What are you doing to make sure it's a positive culture? So there is a solid business reason as well as a moral reason and a sort of legal reason. There is a solid business reason to make sure that you're that sort of culture, and that when you recruit people, you can say hand on heart, we do have a positive approach to mental health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's the whole piece. Interested, you said organisations can't put their hands over their ears and their eyes and, you know, pretend this stuff's not happening. But where the grey area exists, perhaps, is when you're thinking about collecting data around this sort of stuff. So, you know, whether it's HR-related data, attrition, you know, grievances, all these sorts of things. I'm assuming there are certain things that they have to, by law, collect, perhaps. I don't know.
Not much at
Right.
all, really. No, very limited. But the data you need to collect is very limited.
Okay.
And in
Okay.
some cases, it only relates to larger organisations, so you don't have to collect a lot of this stuff. I mean, in terms of being able to defend yourself in a tribunal claim or in some other form of litigation, the more data you have, the better. But there's no real requirement to compile this kind of stuff.
Got you. Well, you said the more data you've got, the better. But could there be a case where an organization thinks almost, it's if I don't know it, I can't be proved to have seen it. So if we do a survey and it says that 99% of our employees are completely stressed out and burnt out, then all of a sudden we've got an obligation legally, I would guess, to a certain extent, to have to do something about that. If we don't do the survey,
Yeah, but if you don't do this, but if you don't do the survey, of course, the risk is that these issues suddenly come up and bite you on the nose, and you haven't seen the warning. That's the problem. But the thing to bear in mind is that cases, particularly employment cases, are brought on an individual basis. And so even if you have, even if you get a poor result from a survey, even if it shows that most of your staff are stressed, because claims are brought on an individual basis, that's relevant evidence, but the individual still has to show that in their case you didn't behave in a way that a tribunal would expect you to. So even with that data, I mean, in some ways, I say to employers, it is better still to know that, because you stand a chance of fixing the problem, don't you? If you don't know what the problem is and you don't know where the problems are, you stand no chance of fixing it. And that's true for small and big organizations. If you find a pocket, let's say, for example, you do a staff survey and you discover that there's one particular part of your organization that's doing really badly in terms of, the way they feel about work, that's a warning signal for you to say, well, actually, maybe we need to intervene in this area. Maybe we need to make sure that management's better. Maybe we need more training, whatever the intervention is. But generally, I would say being able to see that's better than putting your head in the sand and hoping claims don't come in. Because increasingly, people are bringing claims. We're seeing the numbers of claims are going through the roof. They're going to increase because the government's changing some of the rights around employment issues. So I don't think it's much of an option, really, to put your head in the sand and say we're not going to find out where the problems are.
yeah, no, and I agree. By the way, I'm not.
No,
But this
it's
isn't
good
me
to be devil's
advising
advocate. It's good to
organisations
be
not.
to be devil's advocate. I think it's good to
Yeah,
challenge
yeah,
these
yeah,
views
yeah.
sometimes. But yeah, I think knowledge is better.
Yeah, absolutely. So, is there any other advice you'd give to employers, in addition to collect as much data as you can? Is there anything else that you'd suggest?
I mean, there's lots you can do, and there's lots that would be sensible to do. One of the areas, particularly in relation to well-being, I think, is training for managers. Very
Mm,
often managers will tell you that they feel completely exposed and they can't manage these issues. And if you think about employees in their team, you might have several people with significant concerns or significant mental health issues, and most managers will tell you they don't feel able to deal with those things. So I would focus on training. I think training for managers, even if it's just awareness training, making people aware of neurodiversity, making people aware of stress and how that materializes, all those kind of things, that puts them in a stronger position. And then supporting them properly through any process. If you're taking somebody through an ill health process or whatever it happens to be, making sure they have the right level of support.
yeah, and one of the things you talked about during the event, I'm led to believe, was around policies as well.
Yes,
So,
well-being
so
policies.
that
Yeah,
that no brainer for you having
it
some of those
is. I
policies.
mean, you're not obliged to have it. So, there aren't any policies that you're obliged to have as an employer. So if you have them, you've got to tell employees, of course, but you're not obliged to have any. But a well-being policy, I think, is a very sensible way of saying, both to the external world, but also to your own employees, we care about your well-being and we're doing all these things to make sure that you're protected and it's maintained. You're not obliged to do it, but it's a very, very positive thing to do from my perspective.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I've seen policies becoming more prevalent is due to the fact that a lot of tender processes that organisations go through, those things are expected as part
Yeah,
of that, right? You need to
absolutely that.
provide evidence to win the contract that you're looking after the well-being of your employees.
And that's changed, doesn't it, over the last few years? I mean, we see that increasingly. The contracts that we bid for, when we bid for work, we see it from our clients. Increasingly, people will be asking about things like sustainability. They'll be asking about what you're doing for employee welfare, how you deal with concerns, all that kind of thing. And in a way that we hadn't seen until, fairly recently. So you're right. And again, it comes back to this point, doesn't it, about good, solid business reasons for doing this, as well as the moral case. There's good reasons to do it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, if you were going to crack out the crystal ball and look into the future, look into 5, 10, I don't know, 15 years from now, and how the world of work changes in this sort of area, what changes do you foresee?
Big challenge is AI, I think. I think
Okay.
AI is going to make a major difference, and that will have an impact on well-being for sure.
In what way?
Well, because in lots of ways, actually. I mean, I think the obvious one is people's jobs are going to change. And so many jobs are either going to disappear, which is going to give rise to other problems, or they're going to be fundamentally different. So that's the first thing. And that's going to have all sorts of impact on employees. It's going to create stresses, opportunities as well, of course. And some of the sort of drudge work that we currently do is going to disappear. So that's a positive thing. But then also things like employee monitoring, is that going to increase? If you're able to do that, is that going to lead to more stress because you're going to feel more under pressure? I mean, we hear all these stories, don't we, about delivery drivers and other people that are constantly being monitored, and that's having an impact on their health and well-being. So I think that's a real challenge. And, the sharing of data, all those kind of things that are going to happen, AI is going to be a lot better at. Even things down to recruitment. I mean, we're seeing an increase in the use of AI for recruitment processes, and that creates well-being issues, doesn't it, as well? So lots, I think.
In what sense? In terms of
Well,
them not being treated fairly? Or...
yeah, exactly that. So if you look at some of the stories about selection through AI are shocking. So, there is a story about, I won't name it, but a very well-known brand creating this AI product that's selected from a list of candidates. The problem that they identified fairly soon in the process was that I think it was a software developer type role, but historically all the data indicated that the best people for this job were men.
Right.
Because historically that was true. If you look at the numbers of people that are successful, and so what this AI model was doing was weeding out all the women.
Mm.
Anything on a CV that indicated you were female meant you were binned because, their model, the model that the AI was using, was basically saying men are much better at this job than women. And so it created inadvertently a problem where all the people that were being put through were men. And I think the real challenge is that most of us had clueless about AI. And so we don't actually know what the black box is doing. It's a black box problem. We don't know what's in there. And it can create all sorts of skewed outcomes for people if you're not careful. So you've got to be very careful about the data you put in the first place.
Yeah, that's an interesting one though, because absolutely agree with what you're saying there. But it's interesting how when we change anything and we move to a new place, so we move to AI, we suddenly compare it as if the previous version was perfect, and the hiring managers before AI were like completely unbiased
Yeah.
and wouldn't
And
have
that's
done
not true.
exactly the same
Yeah.
thing and
Yeah.
discriminated against the women and put all the men through. Like
And
so.
we know that's right, Matt. I mean, that's clearly correct. I think the problem with AI though is that we seem to think it's a better way of making decisions, and many times it is a better way of making decisions. But I don't think it's instinctively the case. You wouldn't instinctively think an AI selection process is going to be discriminatory. You wouldn't instinctively think that, would you? You'd think, well, it's going to do it based on merit and it's going to do it based on other things. But because the database that was given to it was skewed in a particular direction, it did what it was told to do.
The monitoring's fascinating. I read a study about this very recently, actually, how, put very simply, stress levels were higher for the group the more they were being monitored, and it was all sorts of different monitoring, things that were meant to be positive. So one was physical health monitoring. They gave people your whoop bands and looked at their heart rate variability and this sort of thing. So they, were trying to do something positive for the workforce, but actually people were perceiving that as Big Brother's looking over, or AI Big Brother's looking over my shoulder and monitoring me, led to higher levels of demands and stress. It's really interesting. And it'd be interesting to see how that changes over time.
So I think, yeah, absolutely. I think that's going to be a big feature. The other thing that we've seen in recent years, which we're going to see more of, is people identifying as neurodiverse and saying, I have these conditions, which in some cases are harder because they don't fit neatly within any particular sort of category or health condition. It's just the way in which their brains are wired. People say my brain is wired differently and I need different support or I need different ways of working.
And that those things, as I understand it, I am not a neurodiversity expert, by the way, but most of them exist. And I don't even think you're meant to say this phrase, but on a spectrum, right?
Yes. Yeah.
My understanding is it's not quite so easy as saying this person has ADHD, this person doesn't. Well, it's a diagnosable neurodiverse trait, but there are different levels of it, right? I'm assuming.
Absolutely right, and that's absolutely right. I mean, again, I'm not an expert by any stretch, but you've only got to think of things like dyslexia, for example. Some people have very mild dyslexia, and it doesn't really have much of an impact on their day-to-day lives, and you've got other people that are severely dyslexic, and it has a massive impact. And the same for ADHD, the same for Asperger's. All these neurodiverse traits actually are, as you say, on a spectrum. There's a wide range. And that's challenging for employers, of course, because there is a temptation. I talk about it I refer to one of the cases in one of the sessions I did a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes employers assume things about certain people. So in the case that I was referring to, there were assumptions made about somebody with dyslexia. They're going to be like this because they've got dyslexia. These are the things they're going to need. And that isn't the case necessarily. You've got to look at each individual and take a view about what they need. So, and that's a challenge, isn't it? Because as employers, it'd be nice if we could just say, here's a simple solution. Anybody with autism will just do these things, but you can't. You have to address it on an individual level, and that's a challenge.
Wow. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, it's tricky. That's a technical legal phrase I use all the time, Matt. It's tricky. It's a tricky thing to manage, but there aren't any easy answers. And our job, the job that I do day on day, is to try and give the best answers based on what we know. But there's no perfect solution to these challenges.
Yeah, as a psychologist, my favourite phrase is "it depends."
Yeah, absolutely. Lawyers use that all the time. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It depends on the facts of the case, is what we tend to say. But it's true. It becomes one of those things that you trot out and people roll their eyes. But it is true, and so many of these cases could go in different directions based upon the individual facts.
I've not considered that before we logged on for today. The overlap between psychologists and lawyers and solicitors.
It's there.
Yeah, well, it's human behaviour, isn't it? It's anything that involves human behaviour. Because the answers where I give the answer, it depends, is anything that involves human behaviour. Because they would love, again, organisations would love to have, just tell me the 3 things I need to do to make sure no one's ever stressed and everybody's well-being's optimised. And I'm like, I wish I could. I wish I could give you those 3 things. I'm not holding them back for whatever reason. It's just, it depends on the people, on the situation, on the context, the culture of your organisation. It depends on a whole heap of different things.
Well, we have the same thing, exactly the same. Clients would love me to say you do 1, 2, 3, and then it's all solved. And of course, that isn't the case. You can do a number of things. And in my case as well, the added complication is it depends on your appetite for risk. Because employers have to think about where they are in terms of taking action. So you can take quick action, but that exposes you potentially to more litigation, or you can take longer action, do things in a slightly more elongated fashion and reduces it. So you've got all those factors taken into account. I try not to say to clients, you can't do X, because you can do anything. You can sack somebody tomorrow without any thought whatsoever. It's whether you're prepared to put up the consequences, which might be a tribunal claim you're going to lose.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Right then, I'm going to finish with one final question, which is a little bit different. And I'm stereotyping you now. So people working in the legal industry, stereotypically not stressed ever, right? Their well-being's always...
I'm never stressed. I'm always relaxed, always very, very calm. Yes.
How do you find levels of stress in the legal industry? And linked to that, how do you look after your own well-being?
Both good questions. I mean, it is a very stressful profession. Years and years ago, there was a case that came out that said there's no professions that are inherently more stressful than others, but I don't think anybody believes that. There are certain professions that are, and lawyers have lots of different competing demands. If you're senior in a law firm, you're managing a team of people, which again comes back to your point about managing people and the psychology. We're managing clients. We're getting increasingly, with the speed of communication now. When I qualified, the fastest you'd ever get anything was probably a couple of hours from a client because they'd fax something through. And I remember the fax boy running up to I make myself sound ancient now, but the fax boy or girl would run up to the office and give you this fax, and that meant it was really urgent. Now clients can email me at 8:30 in the morning and they expect an answer by 9:15. And so you've got to find a way of managing that stress as a lawyer, because the inputs are never ending. You're always going to be inundated. And so you have to find a way to do it. I think in terms of my own personal well-being, I don't think I do a particularly good job at times, like all of us. I struggle with that. I think trying to have a definitive end point of the day is the most important thing, and just saying, right, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then I'm going to close down, because I've got an infinite number of inputs. I'm never going to get to a point in my life when I've dealt with all of the emails, I've dealt with all the tasks. It's not going to happen. So I have to get to a point where I say, right, I'm just going to close my computer down, go to the gym, do whatever I'm going to do, but I have to have a cut-off point. And that's either by reference to I'm going to do 3 things and then I'm going to go, or a definitive, I'm going to finish at 6 o'clock or 6:30 or whatever. But it's a constant challenge, and trying not to work weekends, trying not to work too much out of hours. And I don't always succeed in that, but trying to have a bit of a barrier, because there's no barriers naturally.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that with me. And it's interesting because I've spoken to some lawyers in the past about their own well-being, and the things that always strike me. There's an emotional side to it as well, right? Because you're dealing with people and the tax that could take on you. And the other one that, look, I might be wrong here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but and I'm sure you have lots of positive stories through the work that you do. but it's very rare that I'm going to contact a lawyer because I'm like really happy about things.
It's exactly. Well,
Contact that lawyer because I'm so happy.
it's a really interesting point. We're fortunate in that we get asked to go sometimes to staff awards. So my NHS clients in particular ask us to go to staff awards, and I love going because a staff awards is all about positivity, about all the good things that employer is finding from their employees. So it's a really positive experience, right? But that's so different from what we do on a day-to-day basis, because nobody ever rings me and says, we've got this brilliant employee, there are no problems with them, everything's going well, just wanted you to know. They never do that.
Yeah.
So you're right. So you do need positivity.
Can you tell me the legal ramifications of doubling their wage, please?
Exactly that. You never get that. We never get those issues, So you do, but so it's good to get that balance. So if you can find some positives, I think that's really important, because we care about our clients, we care about the outcomes, and you invest in that, and you want to make sure that they get the best possible outcome. But that generates its own stress, because people put their trust and their faith in you to do the best job you can. So yeah, it is stressful, but also fun at times,
and rewarding.
And definitely rewarding, yeah, for sure. And there's the obvious rewards, the financial rewards, but it's also about achieving an objective and being able to say to a client, look, we've managed to do this thing for you and it's made your life better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I say, well, the time has absolutely whizzed by. I said half an hour and we've gone over by a couple of minutes, but that's fine because I was so fascinated by some of the things that you were asking.
Thank you. Yeah.
Have lots more questions. I always have more questions at the end of these, but we'll call it there.
We can do another one. We can do another one, Matt, anytime.
We can do another one in the future. Yeah. See, I contact you for positive things,
Good. Yeah, I like that. No, that's good. That made my life a lot better. So yeah, you're welcome to do that in future.
Right then. So my final question, which I always ask, is to give yourself a plug, really. Like, where can people find you if you want them to find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to LinkedIn with me. That's fine, Andrew Davidson. You can come to our website, hempsons.co.uk. So www.hempsons, hempsons.co.uk. And I'm on the normal sort of X and so on. So by all means, drop me a line.
Hopefully, I might see it at one of these future events if we.
That'll be good.
In person at some point.
That'll be good, Matt.
Have an amazing week, and
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Cheers.